Welcome to Passion for Sound, the channel dedicated to thorough and honest reviews of headphones, earphones, DACs, headphone amps, other components and accessories. Basically everything audio related except power amps and passive speakers. My name's Lachlan and my goal is to explore and discuss all kinds of audio topics, even the controversial ones, to help us all find more enjoyment from music. Thanks for watching and enjoy the video. Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today a look at the JDS Labs Element 2. I'd like to start by thanking channel patron Dragon3250 for sending his Element 2 all the way here from North America. It's a big commitment to send a piece of gear, A, because there's the travel time involved, and then there's my lead time on producing reviews, so for him to do that I think is extremely generous, and so I wanted to send a huge thanks out to Dragon3250 for making this review possible. Now that we've said our thanks, let's take a look at the product in question. The JDS Labs Element 2 is an all-in-one unit that works as both DAC and headphone amp in this beautiful, compact, very desk-friendly type unit. It retails for $399 US, which equates to about 515 Australian dollars based on current exchange rates. At that price, it's not cheap for an all-in-one, but it's also quite affordable in the scheme of audiophile products. So of course the big question for this review is how does it stack up for the price when there's other options on the market that you can buy, either cheaper all-in-ones or more expensive separate stacks. So come along with me now as we explore the JDS Element 2. The first thing to notice about the Element 2 is just how wonderfully simple it is. It's a really solid device made out of metal in the most part, and it's just a really nice piece to interact with. It's got this huge volume dial on top, which also illuminates underneath to show you when it's powered on, and it's a really nice smooth glow that comes in and goes out when you switch it off, so it's a beautiful looking and feeling device in all different ways. Operating this massive volume knob is really enjoyable to use, particularly with the orientation being facing up. You just reach out, you adjust it, and away you go. It feels really good to interact with. Now I'm holding it with the back facing you because the front's got almost nothing to look at. It's just got a 6.3mm output for your headphones. On the back is where all the action is. So we've got the USB-B input, we've got a pair of RCA outs, and I had to check then because there's also a pair of RCA ins. So this can operate as just an amplifier or it can be an all-in-one, and that in my experience is fairly uncommon. Normally with devices like this, they give you headphone amp capability and output to external amplifiers, but very rarely do they also give you an input for an analog feed. So I like the fact that the Element 2 gives you lots of versatility. One thing worth noting is that when you do plug in RCAs to the analog inputs, it will automatically default to that as the source for the headphone output. So there's no source switching that you can control in the Element 2. You have to decide whether you want what's plugged in or whether you want to unplug that and just use the DAC in the Element 2. That's maybe a minor drawback, but I also think for the type of device that it's designed to be, it's completely reasonable. In my experiences playing with the Element 2, I would for the most part probably use it as an all-in-one because I think that's really where its value lies, but we'll talk more about that when I start getting into comparisons with other all-in-ones and also separate stacks. While we're still looking at the back though, we've got a couple of buttons to talk about. We've got the gain button there. That's a simple one press option to toggle between high gain and low gain. JDS Labs recommend that you keep the Element 2 in low gain unless you're specifically having trouble reaching the volume levels that you need. The other button operates as two things. Firstly, it's your power button, so a quick press will switch the unit on and off, and a long press will toggle between either the 6.3mm output for your headphones or a volume-controlled preamp output to drive things like active speakers like I've got here on my desk. So it's really designed as an all-in-one unit for PC audio users to give them the ability to drive both headphones when needed, but also active speakers when needed. You could of course use it as a preamp to go to a different headphone amplifier should you wish, but it's really designed for active speakers out the back and headphones out the front. And with that in mind, I think it's a marvellous device for what it's intended to do. And I mean that in terms of ergonomics and features and controls and functions. Obviously we're not talking sound quality just yet, but we will get there shortly. Before we get there though, I do want to talk about this power input I should say. So it's got a normal looking barrel style connector, but in this case, like some of the products that I've seen recently from Shit and Topping, it's using an AC input through that barrel connector. So not your traditional DC inputs, but an AC input. Now that's not particularly unique or unusual, as I've just mentioned, other brands are doing it. What made this particular one a bit unique though, was that the power supply provided, because it had originally been sold to Dragon 3250 over in the USA, because of that, it had a 110 volt power pack. Now in my experience, it's pretty unusual these days to have power packs that are not multi-voltage. Most that you see on the market will run anywhere from 100 through to about 240 volts, and that allows them to operate in North America, but also in Europe and or Australia, as well as other countries of course. I don't mean to exclude anybody there. The point being, they will pretty much work globally. So I went ahead and plugged in the power transformer from the Element 2 that came with it via Dragon 3250. I plugged that in here and heard it making an interesting humming sound. Thinking that it was maybe something to do with the polarity of the plugs, because it was a US connector and therefore I was using an adapter, I removed it and plugged it in at a different power socket to see if I could change up the polarity. What I didn't realise was that I was plugging a 110 volt transformer into a 240 volt power supply. If you've ever experienced anything like that, you probably know what happened next. Within just a couple of moments, there was all sorts of noise coming out of the power supply, and then a pop and a crackle and a whole lot of smoke. Thankfully, I was able to disconnect it before any fire happened, but it was well on its way there. So I just wanted to raise that because it is worth knowing if you happen to look at buying one of these on the second-hand market, you do need to make sure that either you buy it with the correct power supply, or that you can buy a suitable power supply locally, or some kind of adapter that will adapt your local power supply to suit whatever the Element 2 is coming with. So do be aware of that one. It's not a big deal, particularly if you're buying it new. You'll get the right power supply for your region. But if you are buying it secondhand, please beware of that little trap. Thankfully, I was able to buy a 16 volt AC power adapter from a local electronics store. I was able to then wire the cable from the old power supply onto the new one, and away we went. That allowed me to connect the Element 2 up and try it with a whole bunch of different headphones, comparing it with different products like the Loxjie D30, the Geshelli Erish and J2 combo, and to share with you my impressions of how the Element 2 performs. Before I get to the comparisons though, let me talk about the Element 2 in isolation for a moment. The sound that I heard from the Element 2 is punchy, it's dynamic, it's a little bit intimate, but it's not claustrophobic in any way, so there's a really good sense of space between sounds, but the overall soundstage isn't particularly large. The sound from the Element 2 reminds me quite a lot of the sorts of sounds that I'm familiar with from some of the Shit products that I've listened to recently, in the sense that it's smooth and rich, but it's got detail and layering as well. So it's not a thick, overly warm sounding amplifier, but it's definitely smooth, not at all analytical, and it's got a really nice sense of soul and punch and rhythm. So all in all, it's really enjoyable. It's a fun and enjoyable desktop amplifier that I'd be really happy to have as my one and only kind of all-in-one unit. One thing that I haven't mentioned yet is that the Element 2 has massive amounts of power available for the size unit that it is. By using an AC power supply, it's able to produce more power because the voltage swing is dictated by that power supply, and not having to cram extra circuitry inside the Element 2 in order to then take a normal DC input and turn it into AC voltage. So instead, we've got this external AC power pack providing 16 volts into the Element 2, which it can then turn into a relatively massive voltage swing and output 1.5 watts into 32 ohms. So that's a pretty huge performance from a little device like this, keeping in mind that this device is both DAC and amp. So if you think about taking and obviously it's not exactly this clear cut, but think about half of this unit being the amplifier, that's producing a fair amount of performance from a relatively small device. So knowing that it had that sort of power, one of the things I wanted to do was see just how it performed with a whole bunch of headphones. So I ran through some of my more difficult to drive headphones to see how the Element 2 performed driving all sorts of different loads. Up first with a Beyerdynamic DT880 250 ohm, that's the special edition black versions, and those were driven comfortably by the Element 2 on low gain, as all of these tests are, at 11 o'clock on the volume dial. So the volume dial starts at 6 down the bottom here. I was driving the DT880s somewhere around there. To give you context, it goes all the way around to around about sort of 4 o'clock-ish. The next headphone I tried was the Sundara, and the Sundara was driven comfortably around 9 o'clock. And the Sundara is not a particularly easy to drive planar, so it tells me that there's a decent amount of current coming from the Element 2. It's not a massive world-killing amplifier, but it's got surprisingly good amounts of both voltage and current available. To really test it though, I put it up with something that is clearly one of the most, if not the most difficult to drive headphone on the market. I've been lucky enough to get my hands on a pair of Susvaras from Headphone, and the Element 2 in low gain was able to drive them to reasonable levels of performance. I'm not suggesting it's a pairing that you should consider because the Susvaras deserve much better amplification. Not necessarily more power, and I'll cover that off in the Susvara review, but certainly better quality of amplification in terms of transparency, soundstage presentation, transient presentation. All of those things can be done so much better than an amp at a $400 budget. But that said, my question here was, can the Element 2 drive the Susvaras to suitable levels of volume and also maintain a good level of performance? And what I can tell you is that it was driving them comfortably in low gain at about 230-ish. So it was getting towards the end of the Element 2's performance capabilities in terms of its maximum volume, but at the same time I was still in low gain. So what that means is the Element 2, I am comfortable saying, will drive to a level of quality relevant to a $400 DAC and amp combo. It will drive any headphone on the market to good, comfortable, and even loud volumes of listening with no problems at all. And as I said, I will go into the whole question around how much power do you need for certain headphones when I do the Susvara review. So if you're interested in that, make sure you hit subscribe and stay tuned. The final type of transducer, headphone, earphone that I tried with the Element 2 was a pair of somewhat sensitive IEMs. Nothing too crazy, but just something with moderate levels of sensitivity and low-ish impedance. What I found with the IEMs was that the Element 2 is not a particularly good choice for them. The background is nice and black, there's no sense of noise, but getting sufficient usable volume range out of the Element 2 was very, very difficult. There's channel imbalance from about 6 o'clock up to about 7 o'clock. And I found myself with normal everyday IEMs struggling to go much past 7 o'clock in terms of comfortable listening levels. So unless you've got a difficult to drive IEM, like say a Tin Hi-Fi P2, unless you've got something difficult like that, you're really going to find that the Element 2 is not ideal for IEM listening. So do keep that one in mind. Having tested the Element 2 in isolation then, it was clear to me that it performed beautifully with all sorts of different headphones. Its punchy, smooth sound I found to be an excellent pairing with everything I tried. It never got too warm, so for something like the Sundara that is a little bit kind of rich at times, it didn't make those go too far. It was never too much. In fact, it was a beautiful and thoroughly enjoyable pairing with the Headphone and Sundaras. So I think the tuning of the Element 2 is pretty masterful. If you put it with something a bit drier and a bit leaner, like say an HD560S from Sennheiser, it brings a bit of soul to those without overly colouring them. At the same time, it's not too much so that if you're using it with something that has got a bit more warmth to start with, it's not going to take that too far. So I think JDS Labs deserve lots of credit for producing a fantastic sounding DAC and amplifier combo that works with literally any headphone I could try. Not so much IEMs, but any headphone. Having reached the point of thoroughly liking the Element 2 in isolation, it of course became time for me to turn to comparisons to put it into context and see how it performs for the dollars. The only other comparable all-in-one that I happen to have is the Loxjie D30. Now, if you've seen my review of this one, you'll know that this is a little device that really captured my heart. It's not the best device on the planet, it's fairly average in many ways, but it's got a good quality DAC, it's got a decent but low powered headphone output, and it just does everything really nicely. I enjoy it more from a holistic point of view, that it is a nice all-in-one product for a very low price, rather than it being particularly excellent in any one area. So for me, it was a logical comparison to put the Element 2 up against the Loxjie D30. The D30 retails for just $170 US, so it's a full $130 less than the Element 2. It's also, as I've already mentioned, much less powerful, but it's got a few extra features, so things like the ability to change filters, it's got the ability to have a fixed or a variable output, it's got Bluetooth, so it does a few things that the Element 2 doesn't do, but it misses out on providing a level of power to drive all those different headphones that I tested with the Element 2. Comparing the two side by side, what I found was that there were quite significant sonic differences. To start with, the Element 2 is a lot punchier and smoother overall. The treble on the D30 can get just a little bit kind of glassy or splashy at times in comparison. And of course that's going to depend also on the headphones you're using it with, but in comparing the two side by side, I did feel like the D30 just lacked a little bit of quality and refinement in the upper registers. The sound stages were also an area of difference, where the D30 produces a much wider soundstage, but it's also much flatter. The Element 2 provides a bit more depth at the cost of a bit of width. And I think overall, I probably prefer the Element 2 presentation just a little bit over what the D30 provides. It's a bit more realistic from the Element 2 and a bit more engaging and enjoyable. A big part of that is the Element 2 has a much sweeter mid-range sound. As I said before, it's not overly colouring it, it's not overly thick or rich, but it's just sweeter. It's just a more liquid, creamy mid-range without ever getting thick or congested, but just thoroughly enjoyable. Knowing that the Element 2 could take an external feed from an external DAC, I thought a good test here would be to connect the DAC output from the D30 up to the Element 2 to see where the tonalities were coming from. And I was quite interested to find that the tonality coming from the Loxjie D30 is actually from its DAC. So when I connected the DAC in this to the amp in this, what I found was that tonality I described, that slightly glassy or splashy top end and that less kind of liquid, sweet mid-range, all transferred over to the Element 2. So in other words, the Loxjie D30's DAC is the culprit for changing the tonality of the sound and resulting in a slightly less natural and less engaging tonality. I therefore think that not only is the amp in the Element 2 superior in terms of its overall power output and general quality, but also the DAC seems to be better, or at least better implemented compared to the Loxjie D30. And that does make sense because we're talking almost double the price going from the D30 to the Element 2. But what I would say at this point is if you're looking at both and you've got the budget, definitely go for the Element 2 unless there's a feature you specifically need that's on the D30 and not on the Element 2. But if you're just looking for an all-in-one device that's going to plug in and work seamlessly with your headphones and your active speakers, the Element 2 is definitely the go out of these two options. And so with that in mind, let's put aside the D30 and talk about a separate stack compared to the all-in-one. Having recently reviewed the Geshelli Labs J2 DAC here, and having previously reviewed and loving the Geshelli Labs Erish amplifier, I thought this was probably a good combo to put up next to the Element 2. The reason being that if you're willing to spend a little bit more for a couple of separates, this is the sort of thing that I would recommend you look at spending your money on. Now, of course, there are other options on the market from companies like Shit, but I happen to prefer what I've heard from the J2 Erish combo compared to something like the Modius Magnius combo. The combo that I've got sitting here in front of me from Geshelli Labs will set you back $498 US, which makes it just shy of $100 US more than the Element 2. Now, of course, when you look at this, there's a few things to take into account. It's not a simple all-in-one system, it's not as ergonomically beautiful as the Element 2, and it won't drive your active speakers. So there's no preamp output here. This is a dedicated DAC and a dedicated headphone amp. So it's not entirely an apples for apples combo, but I wanted to talk about this in terms of those of you using headphones. If you're looking for the maximum headphone performance, is it worth spending the extra $100 to get a setup like this? Now, putting aside the fact that with a separate system like this, you can always break it apart and upgrade one piece or the other whenever you want, putting aside that, I'm going to treat it almost as one system. Before I do though, I just want to cover off a brief test I did where I checked if the J2 DAC from Geshelli was better than the internal DAC from the Element 2. Reason being, we've got a $299 DAC up against a $399 all-in-one. So if you were buying this, planning on using it as a feed to an external device of some sort, be it a separate headphone amplifier or your active speakers, I was interested to know just how good is the DAC in this compared to a standalone DAC like the J2. And again acknowledging that J2 is not a preamp output. It's a fixed level line output and therefore there's no volume control. You'd need to be controlling the volume on your headphone amplifier or on your active speakers separately. So this is really just a test of what the pure maximum potential is of each of the DACs. And in hooking them up, the J2 was fairly well miles ahead of the Element 2. And that makes sense because we've got a dedicated DAC that's almost, if not, the same size as what's in the Element 2. And the Element 2 is doing preamp, headphone output, and DAC duties all within that space. So it's not a really fair comparison, but I thought it might bring extra context. The J2 provides both more resolution, also a larger soundstage, and is just generally the more refined and higher quality sounding DAC out of the two. But again, it's kind of what you'd expect because you're spending $300 for a pure DAC versus $400 for a DAC, headphone amp, and preamp. So it was really just for me to get a sense of where the Element 2 sits in the scheme of DAC performance. What was more important to me was how the combo here compares to the Element 2 as a headphone amplifier setup. And as you'd probably expect from what I've already said, having compared the DACs in these two, the Geshelli stack was clearly the more resolving and the more detailed sounding setup. The Element 2 still sounded great, but it can't quite keep up with a full stack of separates like this. The Geshelli stack comes across sounding a little bit drier, even though it's a relatively smooth sounding but fairly neutral sort of setup, it did come across sounding a little bit drier than the Element 2. With a headphone like the Hi-Fi Ananda that I recently reviewed here, the Element 2 probably had the better tonality because it's a slightly drier headphone, but also the Erish and J2 combo didn't go too far into getting it too dry and too hard to listen to. Headphones like the Ananda, the HD800S, the original HD800, the HD560S, some of those headphones that benefit from a slightly warmer sound will probably still sound a little bit better from the Element 2, but you are going to sacrifice a little bit of resolution and detail in order to get that. The Erish J2 combo manages to keep things just on the right side of being too kind of neutral and dry, but it is a noticeable difference between the two, and it's where you might actually choose the Element 2 over something like this stack if you do have headphones that need a bit of warming up and a bit of smoothing over. I can't stress enough, the Element 2 doesn't go too far with that smoothness. There's not a headphone I've tried where I felt like it made it thick and muddy and slow. On the other hand though, the Element 2 did give a headphone like the Ananda just the right amount of smoothness to help tame the treble. Whilst the Erish J2 is probably more technically accurate and neutral, it doesn't necessarily make it the more enjoyable tonality. It's technically superior, but possibly not engagement, enjoyment, and preferentially or subjectively superior. So with all that in mind, one other thing I should mention before I wrap up this comparison is that the Element 2 also has slightly more power output. It's a very small margin. I think it's 1.3 or so watts out of the Erish into 32 ohms versus 1.5 out of the JDS Labs Element 2. Now don't quote me on those figures because I am doing it off the top of my head. I didn't put it in my notes here, but it's a very small difference. However, it might be enough of a difference to be relevant if you have very difficult headphones to drive. Ultimately, where all of this leaves us is to say that whilst a stack like the Geshelli stack here may perform at a technically slightly superior level, it really showed me the value in something like the Element 2. If I personally had to choose between the two for pure headphone listening, I would still lean this way. But if I wanted an all-in-one and or I wanted something that was going to drive active speakers, the Element 2 would be very high on my list. I think the combination of the ergonomics, the simplicity and the wonderful simplicity, not the lacking simplicity, but the wonderful simplicity of the Element 2 just makes it an absolute joy. It's a product that I really relished the opportunity to interact with on each occasion that I was testing, generally using it in my day-to-day sort of computer use, doing editing of videos, watching YouTube videos, a bit of music listening. It was just a real joy to interact with and use constantly, and so even though it's not the pinnacle in sound quality compared to, say, a slightly more expensive stack, it brings so many other benefits that I do think it's worth considering. So if you're in the market for an all-in-one desktop style unit for computer audio using headphones and or powered speakers, definitely check out the JDS Labs Element 2. As I've already said, it's particularly strong if you've got headphones that lean a little bit towards the dry and neutral and lean side, but it's going to work beautifully with any headphones I think I can imagine. If that sounds appealing to you, as always, I'll put a link down below in the description so you can click through to JDS Labs and pick one up for yourself. Before I wrap up, I want to once again say a huge thanks to Dragon3250 for sending me the Element 2 for review. It's a great chance to share a wonderful product with all of you viewers out there. So Dragon3250, thank you once again. I really appreciate the opportunity. For now though, let me leave you all to the music. So happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.